I expected another suffocating Thanksgiving where we feigned affection to save face, but with one casual remark about sending me $1,500 a month for rent. My grandfather transformed the dining room into a crime scene. The chilling realization was not just that I was broke while they prospered, but that my grandfather had been the mark for 5 straight years. The truth he revealed did not just shatter our family. It unraveled a perfectly orchestrated heist. My name is Brianna Cole, and standing on the front porch of my parents' house in Maple Ridge, Ohio, felt less like a homecoming and more like walking voluntarily into a lion's den. I was 32 years old, a grown woman who ran her own schedule and paid her own bills. Yet my hand trembled as I reached for the polished brass door knocker. It had been 3 years since I had set foot in this house. The last time I was here, I had been ushered out the back door with a trash bag full of clothes and a lecture on personal responsibility ringing in my ears. But today was different. Today was theater. My grandfather, Walter Hale, was coming to Thanksgiving dinner. Grandfather Walter was a man of industry, a recluse who had built a shipping empire and then retreated behind the high walls of his estate in Connecticut. He rarely socialized, and he almost never traveled for holidays. His acceptance of my mother's invitation was the equivalent of a papal visit. That was the only reason I had been invited. My mother, Melissa, needed the set to be complete. She needed the dutiful daughter to round out the tableau of the perfect, thriving American family. When the door swung open, the scent of sage and roasted turkey hit me, instantly followed by the overpowering fragrance of expensive lilies. "Brianna," my mother said. She didn't hug me. She performed a hug, leaning in close so her cheek barely grazed mine, ensuring her makeup remained pristine. "You're late. Grandfather is already in the solarium with your father." "I'm on time, Mom," I said, checking my watch. "It is exactly 4 o'clock. "Just come inside and fix your hair," she whispered, her voice dropping to that sharp, serrated tone she reserved only for me. "And please, for the love of God, do not talk about your struggles, not today. We want Grandfather to have a pleasant evening." I walked inside, and for a moment, I lost my bearings. The house I remembered was a modest, comfortable colonial. This place looked like a page torn out of an architectural digest. The floors were new, gleaming hardwood laid in a herringbone pattern. The kitchen, visible through the archway, boasted marble countertops that must have cost more than my car, and a 6-burner professional range that looked like it had never seared a steak in its life. "Impressive," I muttered. "We've done some renovations," my sister, Sloane, said, appearing from the hallway. Sloane was 28 and the golden child, currently wearing a cashmere sweater that looked soft enough to melt butter. She held a glass of white wine and looked me up and down with a mixture of pity and disdain. "It's been a good year for the family. Brianna, try not to look so shocked. It's rude." "Hi, Sloane," I said, fighting the urge to turn around and leave. "You look nice." "I know," she said simply, turning on her heel. "Come on, Walter is waiting." We moved into the solarium. My father, Evan Cole, was standing by the wet bar, laughing a little too loudly at something my grandfather had said. Evan was wearing a suit that hugged his shoulders a little too tightly, the fabric shimmering under the recessed lighting. He looked like a man trying to convince the world he was important. Sitting in a leather armchair, looking utterly unimpressed by the performance around him, was Walter Hale. He looked older than I remembered, his hair completely white now, but his eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses were as sharp as cut glass. He didn't look frail. He looked like a dormant volcano. "Brianna," Walter said, his voice gravelly and warm. He bypassed my father's attempt to introduce me and held out a hand. I walked over and took it. His grip was firm. "Hi, Grandpa. It's good to see you." "You look thin," he said, not as a criticism, but as an observation. He pulled me down to kiss his cheek. "Are you eating? You working too hard?" "I'm fine," I lied. "Just busy. Work is steady." "She's focusing on her career," my father interjected quickly, stepping in to smooth over the rough edge of reality. You know how it is in the city, fast-paced, but she's doing great. We're all doing great. Walter didn't look at my father. He kept his eyes on me. I'm glad you came, Brianna. I know you and your mother have your differences. It means a lot to me that you're here. For a second, the armor I had welded around my chest cracked. That was the thing about Walter. He was the only person in this bloodline who looked at me and saw a person, not a disappointment or a prop. I wouldn't miss it, I said, and for the first time since arriving, I meant it. Dinner was an exercise in suffocation. The dining room table was set with china I had never seen before, rimmed in platinum. There were 3 forks, 2 spoons, and crystal goblets that caught the chandelier light. The food was technically perfect: turkey with truffle stuffing, glazed root vegetables that looked like jewels, and a cranberry reduction that had probably taken 3 hours to make. But the atmosphere was so brittle I felt like if I dropped my fork, the air would shatter. I sat across from Sloane, who picked at her food with surgical precision. My parents flanked Walter at the heads of the table, guiding the conversation with the intensity of air traffic controllers avoiding a collision. They talked about the neighbors. They talked about the new country club membership. They talked about Evan's consulting business, which always seemed vague to me, and Melissa's charity work. It was a monologue of success. And the market has been kind to us, Evan said, swirling his wine. We were able to finally redo the master bath last month. Imported Italian tile. You should see it. Walter. I'm sure it's lovely, Walter said politely. He took a bite of turkey and chewed slowly. And you, Brianna? How is your place? You're still in that spot on 4th Street? I froze. I hadn't told them where I lived. I didn't want them to know I was living in a studio apartment above a laundromat because it was the only thing I could afford while paying off the medical debt from my surgery last year. I moved, I said quietly. I'm on Oak Street now. A lovely area, my mother chimed in, though she had no idea where Oak Street was. It was actually a neighborhood where you didn't walk alone after 9 at night. She's got a charming little place. I looked at my mother, shocked by the ease of the lie. She smiled at me, a tight, warning smile that bared her teeth. Play along? Her eyes screamed. I looked down at my plate, cutting a piece of potato into microscopic squares. I felt an intense wave of isolation. I was sitting less than 3 feet from my sister. Yet we existed in different universes. They had Italian tile and country clubs. I had overdue notices and shifts at the diner that I worked on top of my paralegal job just to keep the lights on. I wasn't jealous. I was just tired. I was tired of being the failure in a room full of manufactured success. Well, Walter said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, I am glad everyone is settled. I worry, you get to my age, and you worry about your legacy, about your family being secure. You have nothing to worry about, Walter, Evan said, beaming. We are thriving, truly. The plates were cleared. The tension should have dissipated with the arrival of the pumpkin pie and heavy cream, but for some reason, Walter seemed to be growing more serious. He wasn't eating his dessert. He was tapping his finger against the stem of his wine glass, a rhythmic, hollow sound. That is good to hear, Evan, Walter said, because the cost of living these days is criminal, absolutely criminal. It is, Melissa agreed, pouring him coffee. But we manage. Walter turned his head slowly and looked directly at me. His expression was soft, benevolent even. And that is why I wanted to make sure things were easier for you. Brianna, I know starting out is hard. I blinked, confused. I'm okay. Grandpa, really. You don't have to be proud with me, he said, waving a hand dismissively. I was happy to do it. When your mother told me 5 years ago that you were struggling with rent, I didn't hesitate. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a dinner party lull, but the vacuum-sealed silence of deep space. I frowned, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth. What? The rent support, Walter continued, oblivious to the fact that my father had just stopped breathing. The $1,500 a month, I know it's not a fortune, but in Ohio, that should cover a decent apartment, I just wanted to make sure you had a roof over your head so you could focus on your career." Time seemed to warp. I looked at Walter, then at my mother, then at my father. $1,500? I repeated. The number sounded foreign, like he was speaking a different language. "Grandpa, I don't know what you're talking about." My mother let out a sharp, high-pitched laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Oh, Brianna, you know how grandfather gets with details. Let's have some more coffee, shall we?" "No," Walter said. His voice wasn't loud, but it stopped my mother's hand in midair. He looked at me, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean you don't know?" "I've been sending the checks to your mother to deposit for you, every first of the month, for 5 years. I sat there, my mind racing, trying to do the math. $1,500 a month, for 5 years. That was an obscene amount of money. That was money that would have stopped me from getting evicted 3 years ago. That was money that would have paid for the surgery instead of me drowning in high-interest payment plans. I looked at my mother. Her face had drained of color, leaving 2 patches of rouge standing out starkly on her cheeks like clown makeup. My father was staring at the centerpiece as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Sloane was looking at her phone, but her thumb wasn't moving. "I never received any money," I said. My voice was quiet, trembling. "Grandpa, I have never received a single cent from you or anyone in this family since the day I left." "Brianna, stop it," my father snapped, his voice tight with panic. "You're confusing him. You're not good with finances. We've discussed this." "Discussed what?" I asked, my voice rising. "I work 2 jobs. I count every penny. If someone was sending me $1,500 a month, I would know about it. I wouldn't be living in a studio above a laundromat." Walter turned slowly to look at his daughter. The warmth was gone from his eyes, replaced by the cold, calculating look of the man who had crushed competitors for 4 decades. "Melissa," he said, "explain." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the dining room. The question hung there, suspended in the scent of roasted turkey and expensive perfume, demanding an answer that nobody seemed willing to give. I looked at my grandfather, whose face was a mask of deepening confusion, and then at my parents, who looked like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming semi-truck. "Grandpa," I said, pressing my hands flat against the table to stop them from shaking, "you said you have been sending money. To whom? How?" "To your mother," Walter said, his eyes never leaving Melissa's face. "Direct deposit, every month, specifically designated for your housing expenses." "Brianna, stop this right now." My father, Evan, barked, cutting the air with his hand. He stood up, his napkin falling to the floor unnoticed. He forced a laugh, but it came out sounding like a dry cough. "Walter, you know how kids are. They don't understand the complexities of financial planning. We didn't want to burden her." "Burden me?" I stood up too, my chair scraping loudly against the herringbone floor. "You didn't want to burden me with money?" "It is not about the money. It is about management," Evan insisted, turning his charm on Walter, though sweat was beginning to bead on his upper lip. "Brianna has always been impulsive. We all know that. We decided, as her parents, that it was best to hold on to the funds for her, a sort of safety net. We are keeping it safe until she proves she is responsible enough to handle it." Walter didn't blink. He didn't look at Evan. He looked at the crystal glass in his hand as if inspecting it for cracks. "If the money is for her," Walter said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet, "why does she not know it exists?" "Because she would spend it." My mother, Melissa, cried out. She clasped her hands over her chest, tears instantly welling in her eyes. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times, usually deployed to get out of speeding tickets or social obligations. "Oh, Daddy, you don't understand. We only want what is best for her. We were so afraid. If we gave her that kind of cash, $1,500 every single month, she would just blow it. She would lose her way. We are protecting her." "Protecting me from what?" I demanded, my voice rising. From paying my electric bill? From buying groceries that aren't instant noodles? See? Melissa pointed a shaking finger at me, looking at Walter. Look how unstable she is. This is exactly why we couldn't trust her with it. She gets so emotional. I am emotional because I am finding out that for 5 years, while I was working double shifts and skipping meals, you were sitting on nearly $90,000 intended for me. The number hit the table like a physical blow. $90,000. Walter turned his gaze to Melissa. You called me, he said. 5 years ago. You called me in tears. You told me Brianna was failing. You told me she could not survive on her own, that the city was chewing her up. You asked for my help because you said you had no more money to give her. He paused, letting the logic sink in. If you were keeping this money to protect her from herself, Walter continued, why did you tell me she was destitute? Why did you ask for a subsidy if you were just going to put it in a savings account? It's complicated, Evan stammered. The market. We invested it for her future. Invested it? Walter raised an eyebrow. Show me. What? Evan blinked. Show me the account, Walter said. If you are holding it for her, show me the balance right now. Open your banking app. Let's see this safety net. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air conditioner hummed, a low drone that sounded like a countdown. Evan patted his pockets, looking for a phone that was sitting right in front of him on the table. I can't access it right this second, Evan muttered. The password it's on the main computer in the study. I'd have to go look it up. You don't know the password to your daughter's trust fund? Walter asked dryly. Oh, for God's sake, just stop it! The voice came from my right. Sloane slammed her wine glass down, wine sloshing onto the pristine white tablecloth. She glared at me, her eyes narrowing into slits. You are so ungrateful, Sloane spat. They are doing this for you. Brianna, you think you could handle $1,500 a month? You? You can't even pick out a decent pair of shoes. You'd probably spend it on some loser boyfriend or some ridiculous get-rich-quick scheme. They saved that money so you wouldn't end up on the street. And now you are trying to humiliate them? I looked at my sister, really looked at her. I saw the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. I saw the designer bag sitting on the floor by her chair. I saw the way she wasn't surprised by the mention of the money. She wasn't confused like I was. She was defensive. A cold realization washed over me, chilling me deeper than the winter wind outside. You knew, I whispered. Sloane rolled her eyes. Don't be dramatic. You knew about the money, I said, louder this time. You knew Grandpa was sending checks for me. Did you get a cut, Sloane? Is that where the down payment for your new convertible came from? How dare you, Melissa shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. Do not accuse your sister. She has nothing to do with this. She has everything to do with this, I countered. She is sitting there defending theft. Because that is what this is. It is theft. It is not theft if it is family, Evan shouted, finally losing his cool. We are a family. What is ours is yours. What is yours is ours. Is that so? I stepped back from the table, feeling the adrenaline flood my system. The fear I had felt walking into this house was gone, incinerated by the white-hot heat of betrayal. Because I seemed to remember a very different definition of family. Brianna, sit down, Walter said softly. Tell me. No, Grandpa, I won't sit down. I turned to my parents. You say you kept the money because I was irresponsible? Let's talk about responsibility. 3 years ago, I had an infection in my tooth. It needed a root canal. It cost $800. I didn't have it. I called you. Mom, do you remember? Melissa looked away, studying the pattern on the china. I called you crying, I continued, my voice trembling with the memory of that pain. I told you I was in agony. I asked for a loan, not a gift, a loan. And you told me, we are tapped out. Honey, we just don't have it. You told me to gargle salt water and toughen up. We were tight that month, Evan muttered. Tight? I laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. That was the same month you posted photos of your anniversary trip to Napa Valley. The same month Grandpa sent you $1,500 meant for my rent. You took that money. You drank it in wine, while I pulled my own tooth out with pliers and whiskey because I couldn't afford a dentist. Oh my God, Sloane groaned. That is such a lie. You are so dramatic. Is it? I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking, but I found the photo. I shoved the screen toward Walter. It was a selfie I had taken that night, my face swollen, my eyes red, holding the bloody tooth. Look at it. Look at what your protection looked like. Walter stared at the screen. His jaw tightened until a muscle in his cheek jumped. He looked up at Evan, his eyes devoid of any warmth. You told me she was doing well, Walter said. You told me the money was helping her get established. She is lying, Melissa cried, desperate now. She is making it up to hurt us. She has always been jealous of Sloane. She is trying to tear this family apart. I am not the one who tore this family apart, I said, my voice steadying into a cold resolve. You did that the night you kicked me out. You left, Evan shouted. You chose to leave because you didn't want to follow our rules. Another lie, I said, and this time I can prove it. I looked at Walter. Grandpa, do you remember the winter of 2020? The big blizzard? Walter nodded slowly. That was the night they told me to get out, I said. It was 2 days after Christmas. It was 10 degrees below zero. They didn't just ask me to leave. Evan dragged me out of bed at 11 at night and threw my suitcase into the snow because I forgot to lock the side door. He said I was a liability. He said I was a parasite. That never happened, Evan said, his face turning a blotchy red. You are delusional. I went to Tessa Ward's house, I said, locking eyes with my father. I walked 3 miles in the snow in my pajamas because you took my car keys. Tessa's parents took me in. They saw the bruises on my arm where you grabbed me. They took photos. Dad, they wrote down everything I said because they wanted to call the police. I stopped them. I begged them not to because I didn't want to embarrass you. The room went dead silent. The mention of the Wards, a prominent family in town, people my parents desperately tried to impress, sucked the oxygen out of the room. Tessa is back in town, I said, delivering the final blow. And her parents are still alive. They remember that night vividly. They remember feeding me soup because I was hypothermic. And they would be very happy to sit down with you, Grandpa, and tell you exactly what kind of loving family this really is. My mother let out a sob. But it wasn't a sad sound. It was the sound of a trapped animal. Sloane stopped drinking her wine. Evan stared at the table, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. They knew I wasn't bluffing. I think, Walter said, reaching into his jacket pocket, that we are done with dinner. The silence in the room was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the ghost of the winter wind I had just described. I could see my mother, Melissa, trying to formulate a defense, her eyes darting around the table as if the answers were written on the wallpaper. But I did not give her the chance to speak. I was not done. I had 5 years of silence to burn through. You want to talk about the night I left? I asked, my voice dropping to a register that was almost too calm. The kind of calm that comes after you have cried until there are no tears left. Let's be very precise about the inventory of that night. I left with 1 suitcase. It contained 3 pairs of jeans, 5 shirts, my laptop, and my toothbrush. That was it. I didn't take my winter coat because it was in the hall closet and Evan had blocked the door. I walked out in a denim jacket in sub-zero temperatures. I turned my gaze to my grandfather. He was sitting completely still, his hands folded on the table, his face unreadable, but his eyes were locked on mine. He was listening with the intensity of a judge hearing a capital case. I didn't just go to Tessa Ward's house for a cup of tea, Grandpa, I continued. I collapsed on her foyer floor. Mrs. Ward had to cut my shoelaces off because my fingers were too frozen to untie them. Do you know what it feels like to have another mother look at you with that much pity? To have a stranger rub warmth back into your hands while your own parents are probably pouring another glass of wine and congratulating themselves on cleaning house? "We thought you had a place to go," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "We thought you were staying with that boyfriend." I had broken up with him 2 weeks prior, I snapped. "And you knew that. But let's move past that night. Let's talk about the reality of the last 5 years. The years where you were supposedly saving $1,500 a month for me." I walked around the table, pacing slowly. The movement made Sloane nervous. She shifted in her seat, pulling her legs in as if I were a predator circling. "Do you know how much a studio apartment costs in the bad part of the city?" I asked, looking directly at my father. $800 a month. That leaves very little when you are working as a junior paralegal making nearly minimum wage. But the rent wasn't the problem. It was the rest of it. It was the asthma inhalers I stretched for 2 months instead of 1 because I couldn't afford the $50 copay. It was the 3 months I went without heat, sleeping in a sleeping bag in my living room, because I had to choose between electricity and antibiotics when I got bronchitis. "You never told us it was that bad," Evan muttered, looking down at his plate. "You have too much pride." "Pride?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "I called you. I emailed you. I sent you a breakdown of my budget when I was drowning. I swallowed every ounce of pride I had. And do you know what I did when you said no? When you said tough love was what I needed?" I leaned in, resting my hands on the back of the empty chair between my parents. "I got a second job," I said. "I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner on Route 9, from 10 at night until 4 in the morning, 5 days a week. I served drunk college kids and truck drivers. I scrubbed grease off the floor until my hands were raw and blistered. I came home smelling like old fryer oil and stale coffee, slept for 3 hours, and then went to the law firm to file paperwork for people like you." I looked at Sloane. She was refusing to meet my eyes, staring intensely at the diamond ring on her finger. "And while I was wiping tables for $3.50 an hour plus tips," I said, my voice rising slightly, "what were you doing? That was the year 19, right? The year of the tough love?" I pulled my phone out again. I didn't need to look at it. I had memorized the timeline. It was burned into my brain. "I remember logging onto Instagram on my break," I said. "I was sitting on a milk crate in the back alley behind the diner, shivering, eating a cold grilled cheese sandwich that the cook had messed up. And I saw your post. Mom. It was a picture of the new kitchen island. Marble. The caption said, 'Finally getting the dream kitchen we deserve. #blessed. Melissa flinched. "And 2 months later," I continued, relentless, "when I was selling my plasma, literally selling my blood, to pay for new tires so I could get to work, I saw the photos from your trip to Cabo. You, Dad, and Sloane, drinking margaritas on a private boat. You looked so happy. You looked so free." "We needed a vacation," Evan said weakly. "Work was stressful." "Stressful?" I asked. "You told me you were broke. When I asked for $200 to fix my car, you said, 'We are barely scraping by. Brianna, we have nothing to give.' You said the business was suffering. You said the market was down." I turned to Walter. The old man hadn't moved a muscle. He was a statue of judgment. "Grandpa," I said, "you sent them $1,500 every month. That is $18,000 a year, over 5 years. That is $90,000. That is not just rent money. That is life-changing money. That is the difference between me selling my blood and me having a savings account. That is the difference between me eating instant noodles for dinner and me having fresh vegetables." I pointed a shaking finger at the gleaming appliances in the kitchen visible through the archway. "That Viking stove?" I said. "That's my rent money. The lease on Dad's Audi? That's my medical bills. Sloane's sudden ability to open a boutique that never actually sells anything? That is my survival." "It's not like that," Sloane shouted. Finally snapping, she stood up, her face flushed red. "We didn't spend your specific money on those things. Money is fungible. It all goes into one pot." "Oh, thank you, Sloane," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Thank you for the lesson in economics. But if the pot was empty when I asked for help, and then suddenly full when the check from Grandpa cleared, then yes, you did spend my money. You ate my rent. You drove my health insurance. You wore my dignity on your wrist. We were going to give it back, Melissa cried out, tears streaming down her face now, ruining the expensive makeup. We were holding it until you were 35. It was going to be a surprise, a nest egg. A surprise? I walked over to the sideboard where the expensive crystal decanters were displayed. So when I was terrified I would be evicted, that was just part of the surprise? When I was hospitalized for dehydration and exhaustion because I was working 80 hours a week, that was just the prelude to the party? I turned back to them. The energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't just a family argument anymore. It was an exposure. I had stripped them naked in front of the one person whose opinion actually mattered to them. You lied, I said. You didn't just lie to me. You lied to Grandpa. You took his money, which he gave out of love and concern, and you used it to maintain a lifestyle you couldn't actually afford. You are not the successful family you pretend to be. You are grifters, and I was the excuse you used to cash the checks. Walter slowly turned his head. The movement was so deliberate it commanded total attention. He looked at Evan. Then he looked at Melissa. Finally, his eyes rested on Sloane. Is this true? Walter asked. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried more weight than if he had screamed. Daddy, no, Melissa sobbed. She is twisting everything. I am asking a simple question, Walter said. Did you tell Brianna you were broke while you were receiving checks from me? Evan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at his wife, then at his daughter, realizing there was no lie that could cover the timeline I had just laid out. The photos existed. The bank records would exist. The testimony of the wards existed. We had expenses, Evan finally managed to say, his voice cracking. The house, the maintenance, it costs a lot to keep up appearances. Walter, you know that. In this neighborhood, you have to keep up appearances, Walter repeated. He sounded disgusted. You let your daughter starve so you could buy a marble island? She didn't starve, Melissa protested. She is fine. Look at her. She is standing right there. I am standing here, I said, my voice hard as iron. In spite of you, not because of you. I survived because I worked myself to the bone, not because you protected me. I took a deep breath. The anger was still there, hot and roiling. But beneath it was a strange sense of clarity. I had feared this confrontation for years. I had feared their judgment. But now, standing here, realizing they were just thieves in designer clothing, I felt the fear evaporate. I don't want your money, I said, lying slightly, because I desperately needed the money, but I needed the moral high ground more. I don't care about the $90,000. What I care about is that you looked me in the eye, watched me suffer, and then went shopping. The room fell into a silence so profound I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the expensive high-end refrigerator that my pain had paid for. The illusion of the happy family was gone. The cracks were now gaping chasms, and we were all staring into the dark reality of who these people really were. Walter reached into his pocket again. This time, he didn't pull out a handkerchief. He pulled out his phone. I think, Walter said, tapping the screen with a steady finger, that we need to look at the numbers. Specifically, I want to see exactly where my $1,500 went every month, and I do not want to hear any more stories about protection. He looked up at Evan, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in my father's eyes. This wasn't just a grandfather scolding his children anymore. This was a businessman who had just realized he was being embezzled, and he was looking at the culprits. Unlock the phone, Evan, Walter commanded. Now! The air in the dining room underwent a chemical change. The heat of my anger and the humidity of my mother's tears evaporated, replaced by a sterile, arid chill. It was the atmosphere of a boardroom just before a hostile takeover. My grandfather, Walter Hale, was no longer the benevolent patriarch carving the turkey. He was the tycoon who had built a shipping empire by knowing exactly where every single container was located on the globe at any given second. He did not wait for Evan to unlock his phone. He did not wait for another stuttered excuse. Walter reached into his breast pocket and withdrew his own device, a sleek, black smartphone that looked like a weapon in his weathered hand. "Arthur," Walter said into the phone the moment the call connected. He didn't say hello. He didn't apologize for calling on a holiday. "I need you to pull the ledger for the personal disbursements account. Yes, the family trust extensions. Specifically the beneficiary line for Brianna Cole." "Daddy, please," Melissa whispered, her hand reaching out across the table as if to physically stop the radio waves. "You are making a scene. We can discuss this in private." Walter ignored her. He didn't even blink. "I want the last 60 months, Walter said to the assistant on the other end of the line. "Exported as a single PDF. I want dates, transaction IDs, and the memo lines. Email it to me. Now." He ended the call and placed the phone face up on the white tablecloth, right next to the crystal gravy boat. The silence that followed was excruciating. It wasn't quiet. It was a countdown. I watched my father. Evan was staring at the phone as if it were a bomb. He took a sip of water, his hand shaking so badly that the ice cubes clattered against the glass like chattering teeth. Sloane had stopped pretending to be bored. She was sitting stick straight, her eyes wide, realizing that her usual defense mechanism of indifference was useless against a paper trail. We waited. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked, a slow, rhythmic hammer striking a nail. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Then it happened. A sharp, digital ping cut through the room. The email had arrived. Walter picked up the phone. He took a pair of reading glasses from his pocket, unfolded them deliberately, and slid them onto his nose. He tapped the screen once, twice. The blue light illuminated his face, casting deep shadows into the wrinkles around his mouth. "Move your chair, Evan," Walter said. It wasn't a request. My father hesitated, then dragged his chair around the corner of the table so he was sitting right next to Walter. "You too, Melissa," Walter commanded. My mother stood up, her legs unsteady, and moved to stand behind Evan. Sloane remained frozen, but Walter gestured to her with a flick of his finger. She got up and stood next to our mother. "Brianna," Walter said, looking at me. "Stay where you are. You need to see this from a distance so you can see the whole picture." I crossed my arms and leaned against the sideboard, watching the execution. "This is a ledger," Walter said, his voice void of emotion. He was simply reading data. "Let us look at the first entry, November 1st, 5 years ago, outgoing wire transfer, amount, $1,500, recipient bank, Chase, account ending in 459. He paused and looked up at Melissa. "That is your personal account, is it not, Melissa?" My mother didn't answer. She was biting her lower lip so hard it was turning white. "Is it not?" Walter repeated, his voice rising just a fraction. "Yes," she whispered. "And read the memo line," Walter said, pointing a manicured finger at the screen. "Read it out loud, Evan." My father squinted at the screen, sweat glistening on his forehead. "Housing assistance. Brianna." "Scroll down," Walter said. He swiped his finger up the screen. "December 1st, $1,500. Memo. Housing assistance. Brianna. January 1st, $1,500. Memo. Housing assistance. Brianna." Walter kept scrolling. The motion was hypnotic and terrifying. Swipe, swipe, swipe. Each movement of his finger represented a month of my life where I had struggled, where I had cried over bills, where I had gone hungry. "It goes on like this," Walter said, his eyes scanning the rows of data. "Like clockwork. I set up an automatic transfer so I would never forget. I wanted to make sure my granddaughter was safe." He stopped scrolling and turned the phone so the screen faced the three of them. "Here is the summary page," Walter said. "Total disbursements over 60 months, $90,000. The number hung in the air. $90,000. "Now," Walter said, taking off his glasses and folding them on the table. "We have established the flow of capital. The money left my account. It entered your account, Melissa. And as we have established from Brianna's testimony and your lack of a defense, it never left your possession. He leaned back in his chair, looking like a CEO presiding over a bankruptcy hearing. So, Walter said, I will ask you one time, where is the money? It went into the house, Melissa blurted out, her composure finally shattering completely. It went into groceries. It went into the cars. It costs a fortune to live here. Daddy, you don't understand. The property taxes, the club fees, the maintenance. We were drowning. We used it to keep the family afloat. You used it to keep yourselves afloat, Walter corrected her sharply. You used money designated for your daughter's shelter to pay for your country club fees? We intended to pay it back, Evan interjected, desperate to find a foothold. It was a temporary loan. We were going to liquefy some assets next year and set up a trust for her. We got behind. A temporary loan implies consent from the lender, Walter said. Brianna did not consent. I did not consent. That is not a loan, Evan. That is embezzlement. Don't call it that, Melissa shrieked. We are family. That makes it worse, Walter said. A stranger stealing from me is business. My own daughter stealing from her child is a tragedy. He looked at Sloane. And you? You said earlier that money is fungible, that it all goes into one pot. But I see here, Walter tapped the screen again, that on the 3rd of every month, 2 days after my transfer arrived, there is a recurring transfer from Melissa's account to a secondary account ending in 882. That is your account, is it not, Sloane? Sloane's jaw dropped. She looked at our mother with pure betrayal. You said you wouldn't tell him about that. $500 a month. Walter read, transferred to Sloane Cole, every single month for the last 3 years. So, while Brianna was working overnight shifts at a diner to pay for antibiotics, you were receiving a $500 allowance from her rent money? I didn't know it was her money, Sloane cried, her voice high and shrill. Mom just said she was helping me with my car payments. I didn't know. You knew enough to mock your sister for being poor, Walter said coldly. You knew enough to sit at this table and eat this food and wear those clothes while she sat there with nothing. Walter stood up. The movement was sudden, and it made Evan flinch. Walter walked over to the window and looked out at the dark, manicured lawn. He stood there for a long moment, his back to them. I have built companies from the ground up, Walter said, speaking to the reflection in the glass. I have dealt with thieves. I have dealt with liars. I have dealt with corporate spies. But I have never sat at a table with people who could look me in the eye, eat my food, and lie to my face with such absolute comfort. He turned around. $90,000, Walter repeated. That is the principal. If we were to calculate the interest that money would have accrued in a standard index fund over 5 years, we are looking at significantly more. But let us stick to the principal. He walked back to the table and picked up his phone. I am going to leave now, Walter said. Brianna is coming with me. You can't just leave, Melissa cried. We haven't even had dessert. Daddy, please, let's just talk about this. We can fix this. We can write you? You? Walter laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. You think this is about debt repayment? This is about character, and you have none. He looked at Evan. My father was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. He looked small. He looked like the suit was wearing him. Evan, Walter said. My father looked up. His eyes were red. I trusted you to take care of my daughter, Walter said. I trusted you to take care of my granddaughter. You failed at both. Evan opened his mouth. He looked at Melissa, then at Sloane, then at me. He looked at the wreckage of his life that had been dismantled in less than 10 minutes by a PDF file. I'm sorry, Evan whispered. It was the first true thing anyone had said all night besides me, but it was too small. It was a pebble thrown into a canyon. Sorry, Walter said, putting his phone back in his pocket, is a word you use when you spill wine on a carpet. It is not a word you use when you steal a life. Walter walked over to me. He didn't ask if I was ready. He just held out his arm. Get your coat, Brianna, he said. We are leaving. I looked at my family one last time. Melissa was weeping into her hands. Sloane was staring at the wall, her face pale. Evan was looking at the table. Broken. The perfect Thanksgiving dinner. The VIP reception. The performance? It was all gone. All that was left was the truth. And it was uglier than anything I could have imagined. I walked to the closet, grabbed my coat, the same coat they hadn't let me take 5 years ago, and I walked out the door without saying a word. The silence I left behind was louder than any scream. The walk from the dining room to the front door was the longest journey of my life. Yet it happened in a blur of motion. I did not look back at the table where the ruins of my family sat frozen in their guilt. I did not look at the crystal chandelier or the herringbone floors that my hunger had paid for. I simply followed the straight, rigid back of my grandfather as he marched out of the house he had subsidized. When the heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, it severed the connection with a finality that rang in my ears like a gunshot. The cold night air of Ohio hit my face, sharp and biting, scrubbing the scent of expensive lilies and deceit from my skin. Walter did not speak as we walked to his waiting car, a black sedan that idled at the curb like a hearse waiting to carry away the dead. He held the door open for me, his movements courtly and precise, refusing to let the shock of the evening erode his manners. We drove away in silence. It was not an awkward silence, but a heavy, mourning one. I watched the houses of Maple Ridge pass by. Perfect lawns, lit windows, the illusion of safety, and realized that the monsters weren't hiding under the bed. They were sitting at the head of the dinner table. By the following weekend, the sharp edges of the shock had dulled into a dull, throbbing ache, but the clarity remained. I had flown out to Connecticut to stay with Walter at his estate. It was a different world from the flashy, desperate luxury of my parents' home. Walter's house was built of stone and timber, filled with books that had actually been read, and rugs that were threadbare in spots, because they were 100 years old. It was a house that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. We sat in his library on Sunday morning. A fire was crackling in the grate, fighting off the December chill, and the room smelled of old paper and wood smoke. Walter was sitting in his wingback chair, staring into the flames, a cup of coffee untouched on the side table. He looked older than he had at Thanksgiving. The rage that had fueled him at the dinner table had burned down to a pile of gray ash, leaving him looking tired and deeply sorrowful. "I apologize, Brianna," he said, his voice rough. He didn't look at me. I pride myself on being a good judge of character. In business, I can spot a liar from across a boardroom, but I let my own flesh and blood blind me for 5 years. "You couldn't have known," I said, sitting on the sofa opposite him. "They are good actors. They have been rehearsing that role for a long time." "I should have verified," he insisted, shaking his head. "I violated the first rule of my own life. Trust, but verify. I simply signed the checks. I thought I was being a grandfather. Instead, I was being a financier for a charade." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he pieced together the puzzle that had led us here. "Do you know why I asked for the records?" he asked. "Do you know what tipped me off?" I shook my head. "I assumed you just sensed something." "No," Walter said. "It was your uncle, Grant." "Grant?" I was surprised. Melissa's younger brother was the black sheep of the family, a high school history teacher who drove a beat-up truck and rarely came to family events because he couldn't stand Evan's pretentiousness. "Grant went to visit your mother 2 weeks ago," Walter explained. "He called me afterward just to catch up. He mentioned, quite casually, that he was stunned by how well Evan must be doing. He described the renovations. He talked about the new Italian tile, the Sub-Zero refrigerator, the professional landscaping. He told me the house looked like a 5-star hotel." Walter picked up his coffee cup, his hand trembling slightly before he steadied it. "I sat with that information for days," he continued. "I knew Evan's consulting firm had lost its 2 biggest contracts last year. I knew the market was down. The math did not make sense. How could a man who was supposedly barely scraping by, so much so that he needed me to support his daughter, afford a $100,000 renovation?" "So you connected the dots," I said softly. I realized there was a leak in the hull, Walter said, using the shipping terminology that was second nature to him. I just didn't want to believe that the leak was you, or rather, that the leak was them, using you as the whole. I came to dinner hoping I was wrong. I was hoping you would tell me you loved your new apartment and thanked me for the help. But when you looked at me with that confusion, I knew. I looked down at my hands. I felt so stupid. Grandpa, sitting there, realizing I was the only one who didn't know the script. You were not stupid, Walter said firmly. You were loyal. You assumed that parents protect their children. That is a natural law. They violated nature. Brianna, that is not on you. He took a sip of coffee and set the cup down with a sharp clink. The sorrow in his eyes began to harden into something steelier. But there is something else, he said. At dinner, you mentioned your struggle, the diner job, the lack of medical care, but you also said something else when we were leaving. You mentioned you were busy with work. I took a deep breath. This was the part I hadn't told anyone, not even my parents, especially not my parents. I didn't just survive, Grandpa, I said. I didn't want you to think I was just a victim this whole time. Yes, I worked at the diner. Yes, it was hell. But for the last 18 months, I have been building something. Walter leaned forward, intrigued. Go on. I started consulting on the side, I said. Small businesses that needed help navigating zoning laws and compliance but couldn't afford a big law firm. I used my paralegal experience. I worked nights at the diner and days on the business. It started with 1 client, then 3. Now I have 12. I sat up straighter, feeling a flush of pride that I had suppressed in that suffocating dining room. I just incorporated last month, I told him. North Harbor Strategy Group. It is small. I am working out of my apartment, but I'm profitable. I quit the diner 3 weeks ago. I was going to tell them at Thanksgiving, but, well, the mood wasn't right. Walter looked at me for a long time. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, erasing the years of fatigue. It was the first time I had seen him look truly happy since he arrived in Ohio. North Harbor, he repeated. I like the name. It sounds steady. I am steady, I said. I don't need their money, Grandpa. I don't need anyone's money. I'm going to make it on my own. I know you are, he said warmly. You have the grit. Your father doesn't have it. Your mother certainly doesn't have it. But you do. Then, the warmth vanished. It was replaced by a cold, transactional mask. He sat back, crossing his legs, and suddenly I wasn't looking at my grandfather anymore. I was looking at Walter Hale, the tycoon. However, he said, his voice dropping to a low, flat tone, the fact that you do not need the money is irrelevant to the crime that was committed. Theft is not determined by the need of the victim. It is determined by the action of the perpetrator. I know, I said. This is no longer a family dispute, Walter said. I want you to understand that, Brianna, if we go down the path I am preparing, there is no turning back. We are not going to therapy. We are not going to have a mediation circle. We are going to court. You want to sue them? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I am going to destroy the structure they built on lies, Walter corrected. I have already spoken to my attorney, Miles. He is drafting the paperwork. We are going to sue for the return of the principal sum of $90,000. We are going to sue for punitive damages, and we are going to look into the tax implications of them hiding that income. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. But I cannot do it alone, he said. I was the source of the funds, but you were the intended beneficiary. You are the one who suffered damages. You are the one who went without medicine while they bought wine. I need you to be a plaintiff. I need you to stand up in a court of law and testify against your mother and father. He leaned forward again, his eyes locking onto mine. It will be ugly, he warned. They will attack you. They will say you are crazy. They will say you are ungrateful. They will try to drag your name through the mud to save their own skins. They will weaponize every mistake you have ever made. Are you ready for that? I thought about the cold nights in my apartment. I thought about the root canal I performed on myself with whiskey. I thought about the way Sloane had looked at her diamond ring while I talked about starving. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is hot and burns out. What I felt was cold and permanent. It was a realization that if I didn't stop them, they would do it again. Maybe not to me, but to someone else. Or they would just continue to live their lie, believing that they were untouchable, that they could consume people and discard them without consequence. I am not doing this for the money, I said quietly. I know, Walter said. And I am not doing it for revenge, I added. Then why? Walter asked. Why put yourself through this? Because I need to break the loop, I said. For 32 years, I have been the problem. I have been the one who wasn't good enough, who was too sensitive, who couldn't manage. If I walk away now, I am letting them write the end of that story. I am letting them say that I was just a charity case that didn't work out. I looked at the fire, watching a log crumble into glowing embers. I want the record corrected, I said. I want it written down, in a legal document, that I was not the failure, they were. Walter nodded slowly. He reached out and placed his hand over mine. His skin was dry and cool, papery with age, but his grip was as strong as iron. Good, he said. Then we proceed. Miles will be here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Have your records ready. We are going to build a case so tight that they will not be able to breathe. He picked up his coffee cup again, but this time he didn't drink. He just held it, staring at the steam rising in the morning light. They mistook kindness for weakness, Walter said softly. That is a fatal error in business, and it is a fatal error in family. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the poor relation or the black sheep. I felt like a Hale. I felt like the granddaughter of a man who moved mountains, and I realized that the blood in my veins wasn't weak. It had just been waiting for the right war. I'll be ready at 9, I said. Monday morning arrived with the sterile precision of a scalpel. At exactly 9 o'clock, a silver sedan pulled into the driveway of my grandfather's estate. Miles Carver did not look like the kind of lawyer you saw on billboards asking if you had been injured in an accident. He looked like the kind of lawyer who drafted treaties for small nations or handled mergers that appeared on the front page of the Financial Times. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than my entire wardrobe, and he carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy with intent. We met in the library. Walter did not offer him coffee. This was not a social call. I have reviewed the preliminary PDF you sent over on Thanksgiving night, Miles said, placing his briefcase on the mahogany desk and snapping the latches open. His voice was dry, devoid of any theatrical inflection. It is damning, Walter, but in a court of law, damning is an emotion. We need irrefutable. That is why you are here, Walter said, leaning back in his chair. Tell us what you need. We are building a case on 3 pillars, Miles explained, laying out a yellow legal pad. First, the source of funds. That is easy. We have your outgoing wires. Second, the intent. We have the memo lines on every single transfer explicitly stating housing assistance for Brianna. That destroys any argument they might make about the money being a general gift. Third, and this is the hardest part, is the misappropriation. He turned to me. His eyes were pale gray and unblinking. Brianna, he said, I need you to understand something. We are not just proving they took the money. We have to prove that the money did not benefit you in any capacity. The defense will argue that they used the money to maintain the family home, which is technically your home of record in some vague sense. They will argue that by buying groceries, they were ensuring there was food available if you ever visited. It is a weak argument, but it is the only one they have. I haven't lived there in 5 years, I said. Exactly, Miles said. We need to construct a timeline that is airtight. I want you to sit with these bank statements, the ones Walter forced your father to export. I want you to cross-reference the dates of the deposits with your own personal timeline. He slid a stack of printed papers toward me. Look for cause and effect, Miles instructed. The money hits Melissa's account on the 1st. Where does it go on the 2nd? On the 3rd? Does it go to a landlord? Does it go to a university tuition office? Or does it go to Neiman Marcus? For the next 3 hours, the library was silent, except for the scratching of pens and the rustling of paper. It was tedious, unglamorous work. But as I worked, a pattern emerged that was so blatant it was insulting. I took a highlighter and started marking the dates. Here, I said, pointing to a line on the statement from 3 years ago. October 3rd, a payment of $1,200 to Global Travel Agency. That was 2 days after Grandpa's check cleared. And where were you in October of that year? Miles asked, his pen hovering over his notepad. I was in the hospital, I said, my voice steady. I had pneumonia. I remember calling my mother from the emergency room asking if she could help me with the deductible so I could get a prescription for an inhaler. She told me they were cash poor because of tax season. Miles wrote that down. Excellent. Not excellent for you, obviously, but excellent for the case. That is direct contradiction. They claimed poverty to deny you aid while simultaneously using the funds intended for you to book a vacation. We continued. The pattern repeated itself with sickening regularity. November 1st, $1,500 in. November 4th, lease down payment on a luxury SUV. Same week. I asked for help fixing my transmission so I could get to work. Request denied. February 1st, $1,500 in. February 2nd, payment to a high-end catering company. Same week. I was eating expired canned goods from a food pantry because my hours had been cut. This is not just theft, Miles muttered, looking at the spreadsheet he was building on his laptop. This is systematic lifestyle subsidization. They treated your rent money as a monthly bonus. I need you to write an affidavit, Miles told me. I want a sworn statement detailing every single time you asked for financial assistance and were refused. I want dates. I want exact quotes if you remember them. And I want you to state, unequivocally, that you were never informed of the existence of this trust. I can do that, I said. We also need witnesses, Walter interjected. The dinner was private. It is their word against ours regarding what was said. We have the Wards, I said. Tessa Ward and her parents. They were the ones who took me in the night I was kicked out. They saw the bruises. They heard the story immediately after it happened. That establishes the estrangement. It proves that I was not a dependent living under their roof, which destroys their claim that the money was for household expenses. Good, Miles said. I will have my investigator reach out to them for statements. If they are credible, they anchor the timeline of your independence. Then, Miles stopped. He was looking at the bank ledger again, his finger tracing a recurring line item that we had glossed over in the initial scan. Walter, Miles said, you mentioned that you saw a transfer to a secondary account? Yes, Walter nodded. Sloane's account, but we only saw the recurring $500 transfers. We didn't look deeper. I am looking deeper now, Miles said. He typed something into his laptop, filtering the data. It wasn't just $500. Look at this entry from last July. He turned the laptop toward us. July 15th, Miles read. Transfer to Sloan C. Primary, $4,000. $4,000? I frowned. Why? Look at the date, Miles said. Does July 15th mean anything to you? I thought back. July. That was her birthday, I said. She turned 27. And look at the debit from Sloane's account the very next day, Miles said, pointing to a line he had cross-referenced from a social media scrape his team had likely already done. She posted a photo of a new designer handbag on July 16th. Value? Approximately $3,800. She got a $4,000 birthday present, I said, feeling a cold knot in my stomach. From my rent money. It gets worse, Miles said. This transforms Sloane's role in the lawsuit. Before, she could have argued she was a passive recipient, a spoiled child who took allowance without asking where it came from. But look at this transfer here. He pointed to another line. December of last year, Miles said. Melissa's account was overdrawn. There is a transfer from Sloane back to Melissa for $1,000, and the next day, A check clears for the country club dues. They were cycling the money, Walter said, his face darkening. Exactly, Miles said. Sloane wasn't just a child getting an allowance. She was a participant in the laundering. She was moving money back and forth to cover gaps. That makes her an accomplice. She is no longer a witness. Brianna. She is a co-defendant. We are going to name her in the suit. I stared at the screen. Sloane, my little sister. I had always thought she was just shallow, a product of my parents' narcissism. But this was active participation. She had watched me struggle, knowing she was shuffling my lifeline back and forth between her accounts like poker chips. Do it, I said. Miles nodded and closed his laptop. The snap of the lid sounded like a judge's gavel. The rules of engagement, Miles said, leaning forward, his tone shifting from investigator to commander. From this moment on, you do not speak to them. You do not answer their calls. You do not reply to their texts. If they show up at your apartment, you do not open the door. You call the police. They are blowing up my phone, I said, glancing at the device in my purse which had been buzzing incessantly for days. Block them, Miles said. Or better yet, change your number. But more importantly, Brianna, you must stay off social media. Do not post vague quotes about karma. Do not post photos of you and Walter. Do not give them a single scrap of ammunition to claim that you are vindictive or unstable. We are going to be boring. We are going to be silent. We are going to let the paperwork do the screaming. I understand, I said. The complaint is already drafted, Miles said, patting the briefcase. I just need to plug in these new details about Sloane and the specific dates you provided. We will file tomorrow morning at the courthouse. Will they know? I asked. Not until the process server hands them the papers, Miles said. I am not sending a warning letter. I am not asking for a settlement. This is a cold knock. We want to catch them off balance. We want them to panic. When people like your parents panic, they make mistakes. They start hiding assets, or they start talking to people they shouldn't, and we will be watching for that. Walter stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray winter sky. It is a tragedy, Walter said softly, to burn down your own house. They lit the match, Walter, Miles said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. We are just controlling the fire. Miles turned to me and extended his hand. Brianna, get me that affidavit by tonight. Email it to my secure server. Be precise. Be cold. Write it as if you are writing about strangers, not your parents. I can do that, I repeated, and as I shook his hand, I realized it was true. They were strangers. The people who had raised me, who had supposedly loved me, were just names on a bank ledger now. They were defendants, and I was finally, after 32 years, the one holding the pen. One last thing, Miles said at the door. The specific count we are adding for Sloane? It is called unjust enrichment. It is a civil claim, but given the amounts, if the IRS gets wind of it, and they might, once this becomes public record, she could be looking at tax fraud as well. She never declared that income. She always wanted to be famous, I said, a dry smile touching my lips. I guess she's finally going to get some attention. Miles didn't smile. He just nodded and walked out to his car. The machine was in motion. The trap was set, and for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't the one caught in it. The process server must have arrived at my parents' house on Tuesday morning because by 10 o'clock, my phone began to vibrate across my desk like a trapped insect. I was in the middle of a strategy meeting with a new client, a local bakery owner looking to expand her franchise. I glanced at the screen. Mom. I silenced it and flipped the phone face down. For the next hour, the phone buzzed continuously. It was a relentless, frantic rhythm. Buzz, buzz, buzz. It was the digital heartbeat of a family in panic. 5 years ago, that sound would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have wondered what I had done wrong or if someone was hurt. Today, however, it was just noise. It was the sound of consequences arriving at their front door. When my client left, satisfied with our timeline, I finally picked up the device. There were 22 missed calls, 14 from my mother, 6 from my father, 2 from Sloan, and a barrage of text messages that were piling up in the notification center. The phone rang again in my hand. It was Melissa. Against Miles's advice to stay silent, I answered. I didn't answer because I wanted to negotiate. I answered because I needed to hear the tone of her voice. I needed to know if she was calling as a mother or as a defendant. "Brianna!" Her voice was a high-pitched wail, ragged and hysterical. "Oh my God, Brianna, there are sheriff deputies here. They just handed your father a stack of papers an inch thick. What have you done?" "I haven't done anything." "Mom," I said, leaning back in my office chair and swiveling slightly to look out the window at the gray Ohio skyline. My pulse was steady. "Miles Carver filed a complaint. I just signed it." "You have to stop this," she screamed. "You have to call them off right now. Your father is hyperventilating. Do you know what this will do to us? Do you know what people will say if they see this? It is a lawsuit. Brianna, a lawsuit against your own flesh and blood." "The lawsuit is for the recovery of misappropriated funds," I said calmly. "It is standard procedure for theft." "Theft? How can you use that word?" She broke down into sobbing, the kind of breathless, heaving crying that used to make me rush to comfort her. "We fed you. We clothed you. We loved you. And this is how you repay us? By destroying our lives over money? It is just money, Brianna. We can work this out. We can make a payment plan. Just tell the lawyer to withdraw it. Please, I am begging you. I am your mother." I listened to her beg. I listened to the woman who had bought a marble kitchen island while I was eating ramen noodles. I listened to the woman who had told me to tough it out when I had a tooth infection. "Let me ask you a question," I said, cutting through her tears. "And I want you to answer honestly for the first time in your life. Are you crying because you regret stealing $90,000 from me? Or are you crying because you are terrified of losing your house?" The line went silent. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a sharp intake of breath. "How dare you?" she whispered. "That is what I thought," I said. "You are not sorry you did it. You are sorry you got caught." "You are a cold, heartless bitch," she hissed. "I am the daughter you made," I replied. "Goodbye, Mom." I hung up. I didn't feel guilty. I felt lighter. I looked at the text messages next. My father, Evan, had taken a different approach. He wasn't begging. He was attacking. His messages were long blocks of gray text, scrolling up the screen like a manifesto. "Evan, I cannot believe you would humiliate us like this. After everything we sacrificed for you, we paid for your braces, we paid for your piano lessons, we put a roof over your head for 18 years. You think you made it on your own? You are nothing without us. You are an ungrateful child who doesn't understand the real world. This money was family money. You have no right to it. If you proceed with this, you are dead to me. Do you hear me? You are dead to this family." I read the words, and they crumbled into dust. He was trying to invoice me for my childhood to justify stealing my adulthood. Then came Sloan. Her messages were short, frantic bursts, lacking punctuation. Sloan. WTF. Brianna. Sloan. The sheriff just gave me papers too? Sloan. Why am I named in this? Sloan. I didn't do anything. Sloan. You are ruining my life. I have a reputation in this town. If people find out I am being sued for fraud, my business is over. Sloan. Fix this. Sloan. Mom is passing out. Dad is screaming. Are you happy? I typed a reply to Sloan. It was the only text I sent that day. Brianna. Deal with it yourself. Then, I went into my settings. I blocked Melissa. I blocked Evan. I blocked Sloan. One by one, their names disappeared from my active feed, relegated to a digital void where they could scream all they wanted without me hearing a sound. It wasn't an act of petty revenge, it was an act of sanitation. I was cleaning my life. For the next 3 days, the silence from my end was absolute. However, the noise on their end intensified. Since they couldn't reach me, they tried to reach Walter. Miles told me later that Evan had driven all the way to Connecticut. He had stood at the gate of Walter's estate for 2 hours, buzzing the intercom, demanding to speak to his father-in-law. He had tried to play the two men talking business card. Walter never answered. He didn't even turn on the camera. He simply had his security guard tell Evan that all communication must be directed to Miles Carver's office. That was the thing that drove them mad. They relied on emotional leverage. They relied on guilt, on shared history, on the ability to twist a conversation until up was down. But you cannot guilt-trip a law firm. You cannot manipulate a subpoena. By removing himself from the equation, Walter had stripped them of their only weapon. Desperation makes people ugly, and when my family realized they couldn't charm or bully their way out of the lawsuit, they decided to burn the earth. I found out about it on Friday afternoon. I was at a coffee shop near my apartment, reviewing a contract, when an old acquaintance from high school, Jessica, walked up to my table. She looked uncomfortable. "Hey, Brianna," she said, shifting her weight. I didn't know if I should say anything, but I saw your mom at the supermarket yesterday." "Oh?" I kept my expression neutral. "She was talking to Mrs. Higgins, loudly," Jessica grimaced. "She was crying. She said you were having a breakdown. She said you stopped taking your medication and that you've become paranoid. She told Mrs. Higgins that you've concocted this whole delusion about them stealing money from you because you're unwell." I felt a cold spike of adrenaline in my chest. "She said I was delusional?" "Yeah," Jessica said. "She said they are trying to get you help, but you're attacking them instead. She made it sound really sad, like they were the victims of a mentally ill daughter." I thanked Jessica and packed up my laptop. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so pure it felt like ice water in my veins. They were trying to use my health history, my struggles with anxiety and depression in my 20s, which they had mocked, to discredit the hard evidence of their theft. I drove straight to Miles's office. "They are smearing me," I told him the moment I walked in. "They are telling people I am hallucinating the money." Miles didn't look up from his desk. He just nodded, as if he had expected this. "It is a classic defense strategy in family disputes," Miles said. "Discredit the witness. If the plaintiff is crazy, the facts must be crazy too. It is lazy, but effective in the court of public opinion." "It's not just public opinion," I said. "If clients hear this, if the judge hears this..." "The judge deals in evidence, not supermarket gossip," Miles said. He opened a file on his desk. "But we will nip it in the bud. I anticipated this." He pulled out a document. "We are going to file a motion to submit a limited-scope medical summary," Miles explained. "I have already contacted your physician. We are not going to release your therapy notes or your private struggles. That is none of their business. We are going to release a simple, certified timeline of your mental competency." He tapped the paper. "This document confirms that you have been stable, medicated, and fully successfully employed for the last 5 years," Miles said. "But more importantly, Brianna, we are going to pivot back to the math. That is the beauty of financial crimes. It doesn't matter if you are hallucinating purple elephants. Did the purple elephants transfer $1,500 a month into Melissa Cole's account?" "No," I said. "Did your anxiety disorder sign the checks for Sloan's Country Club dues?" "No." "Exactly," Miles said. "We are going to issue a statement to their lawyer. We will inform them that any further discussion of your medical history in a public forum will result in an additional defamation suit, and we will attach the bank records to that warning." He looked at me, his eyes hard. "Let them talk," Miles said. "While they are busy gossiping in the grocery store, we are busy tracing their assets, and I have some news on that front." "What news?" "We found the kitchen," Miles said. "We matched the contractor's invoice to a withdrawal from Melissa's account. The date matches perfectly with the housing assistance deposit from Walter. We have a direct link. They took money labeled for your rent and paid Kitchen Concepts LLC within 24 hours. He smiled, a shark-like baring of teeth. "Let them call you crazy. Brianna, we are about to call them felons." I went home that night and sat in my quiet apartment. My phone was silent. My block list was full. Outside, the world was moving on, but inside my head, the storm had quieted. I realized that their rumors couldn't hurt me anymore. They were just ghost stories told by people who were afraid of the light. I opened my laptop and went back to work on my client's proposal. I had a business to run. I had a life to build. And for the first time, I didn't care what the Coles were saying about me. I only cared about what the judge would say. And I knew exactly what that would be. The courtroom was nothing like the dining room in Maple Ridge. There were no scents of roasted sage or expensive lilies to mask the rot. There was only the smell of floor wax, old wood, and the stale, recycled air of the municipal heating system. The lighting was not the warm, flattering glow of a chandelier. It was the harsh, buzzing hum of fluorescent tubes that left nowhere to hide. I sat on the left side of the aisle, next to Walter. He wore a dark navy suit, his posture rigid, his hands resting on the handle of his cane. He did not look at the defendant's table. I did. Evan and Melissa sat huddled together, looking smaller than I had ever seen them. My father's suit, usually worn with the arrogance of a man who owned the room, now seemed to hang off his shoulders. My mother kept touching her hair, a nervous tic she had developed in the last few weeks. Sloane sat slightly apart from them, dressed in a muted gray cardigan, trying desperately to look like a confused bystander rather than a participant. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Vance presided. She was a woman with sharp features and eyes that seemed to have seen every variety of human greed. She did not look impressed by my family's attempts to appear pitiable. "Mr. Carver," Judge Vance said, her voice cutting through the room, "you may proceed." Miles Carver stood up. He moved with the predatory grace of a shark entering open water. He did not shout. He did not pace theatrically. He simply walked to the podium, placed a stack of documents on the stand, and began to dismantle my family's life with the precision of a surgeon. "Your Honor," Miles began, his voice calm and leveled, "we are here to establish a pattern of conduct that spans 60 months. This is not a case of misunderstanding. This is a case of systematic misappropriation." He signaled to the clerk, and the large monitor facing the judge, and visible to the gallery, lit up. It was the spreadsheet. "Exhibit A," Miles said. "Bank records from the personal trust of Mr. Walter Hale, beginning on November 1st, 5 years ago, and continuing until last month." He tapped a button, and the screen highlighted the first column. "On the 1st of every month, a transfer of $1,500 was initiated," Miles recited. "Please note the memorandum field on every single transaction. It reads, Housing Assistance - Brianna." He let the words hang in the air. 60 transactions, Miles continued, totaling $90,000. Mr. Hale has testified that his intent was solely to provide shelter for his granddaughter, the plaintiff, Ms. Cole. Miles turned to the defense table. "Now, let us look at the destination," he said. "Exhibit B, the primary checking account of Melissa and Evan Cole." The screen changed. It showed the incoming deposits. "We see the money arrive," Miles said. "And now, we look for the exit. If this money was kept safe, as the defense stated in their deposition, we would expect to see it sitting in a savings account. If it was used for Brianna, we would expect to see transfers to a landlord, or perhaps a tuition bursar." He paused, looking directly at Evan. "We see neither." The screen flashed to a new graphic. It was a timeline Miles and I had built, overlaying the deposits with their spending. "November 3rd, 5 years ago," Miles read. 2 days after receiving the housing assistance, a payment of $850 clears to Mercedes-Benz Financial. A payment of $400 clears to the Maple Ridge Country Club. "Objection!" The defense attorney, a sweaty man named Mr. Sterling, stood up. "Relevance? How the defendants spend their own income is not on trial here." "It is relevant, Your Honor," Miles countered smoothly, "because the defendant's account had a balance of less than $200 prior to Mr. Hale's deposit. Without the housing assistance funds, that car payment bounces. Without the housing assistance funds, That club membership is revoked. Judge Vance adjusted her glasses. Overruled. Continue. Mr. Carver. Thank you, Miles said. He went through the list. It was a rhythmic, brutal drumbeat. January. Money comes in. Payment to a travel agent for a trip to Key West goes out. March. Money comes in. Payment to a high-end interior decorator goes out. July. Money comes in. Payment to a luxury caterer goes out. There is not a single transfer to Brianna Cole. Miles concluded. Not $1. In fact, on the dates where these housing funds were being used to pay for vacations and luxury cars, the plaintiff was working overnight shifts at a diner to avoid eviction. Mr. Sterling tried to cross-examine, but his heart wasn't in it. He tried to argue that money is fungible, that by maintaining the family home, they were technically providing a safety net for me. Mr. Cole, Sterling asked my father on the stand, did you consider your home open to your daughter at all times? Yes, Evan said, his voice trembling. Ideally, we always wanted her to come back. So, in your mind, maintaining the house was maintaining a home for her? Yes, Evan said. Exactly. Miles stood up for the redirect. He didn't bring up the money. He brought up the timeline. Mr. Cole, Miles said, you say the home was open to her. Can you explain to the court why, on the night of December 27th, 5 years ago, you changed the locks? Evan blinked, his face draining of color. That was a security measure. We had a break-in in the neighborhood. A break-in? Miles raised an eyebrow. Is it not true that you changed the locks 3 hours after you physically removed Brianna from the premises during a blizzard? We had an argument, Evan stammered. She left voluntarily. Voluntarily? Miles repeated. With no coat? In 10-degree weather? She has a temper, Evan said, looking desperate. We will see about that, Miles said. I called Tessa Ward to the stand. When Tessa walked in, the atmosphere in the room shifted. My parents stiffened. The Wards were pillars of the community, the kind of people my parents desperately wanted to be. To have the daughter of the town's most respected surgeon testify against them was social suicide. Tessa took the oath. She looked at me and gave a small, encouraging nod before turning to the jury. Ms. Ward, Miles said, do you recall the night of December 27th? Vividly, Tessa said. Her voice was clear and strong. I heard a pounding on our front door around 11:30 at night. My father opened it. Brianna was standing there. She was blue, literally blue. She was wearing a denim jacket and pajama pants. She couldn't speak because her jaw was locked from the cold. Did she tell you she had left voluntarily? Miles asked. No, Tessa said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Evan. She told us her father had dragged her out of bed and thrown her suitcase into the snow. She said he told her she was a leech and that he was done paying for her mistakes. And did you see her parents that week? My mother called them the next morning, Tessa said. To tell them Brianna was alive, Mrs. Cole picked up. She said, if she wants to act like a child, she can live like a stray. And then she hung up. A gasp rippled through the small gallery. Judge Vance frowned, making a note on her pad. The loving family defense had just been decapitated. But the final blow was yet to come. I call Sloane Cole to the stand, Miles said. Sloane stood up. She smoothed her skirt, trying to regain some of her usual composure, but her hands were shaking. She walked to the witness box, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Ms. Cole, Miles said, approaching her with a deceptively friendly demeanor. You are named in this suit due to unjust enrichment. You have claimed in your deposition that you were unaware of the source of the funds your parents gave you. Is that correct? Yes, Sloane said, her voice small. I thought they were doing well. They gave me an allowance. I didn't know it was Brianna's money. An allowance, Miles nodded. And you are 28 years old? I was helping with the family business. Sloane lied. I see, Miles said. And does the family business involve money laundering? Objection, Sterling shouted. I will rephrase, Miles said coolly. Ms. Cole, can you explain the activity on your secondary account ending in 882? Sloane froze. She evidently didn't know we had found the secondary account. I have a savings account, she stammered. Exhibit C, Miles said. The screen changed again. Here we see a transfer from Melissa Cole to Sloane Cole for $500. This happens monthly. But look at this entry from last December. He pointed to the line we had found in the library. On December 12th, you received $1,000 from your mother. Miles said. On December 14th, you transferred $1,000 back to your mother, and on December 15th, your mother paid the annual dues for the country club. Sloane said nothing. She stared at the screen. Why move the money back and forth, Sloane? Miles asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Why not just have your mother pay the club directly? I don't know, she whispered. I will tell you why, Miles said, turning to the judge. Because Mrs. Cole's account was being monitored by Mr. Hale's accountant for tax purposes. They needed to show that the money was leaving the account to help the children, so they sent it to Sloane. But they needed the money back to pay their own bills. So Sloane sent it back under the guise of a loan repayment. It was a shell game, and you, Sloane, were the shell. I just did what they told me, Sloane shouted, finally snapping. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her carefully applied mascara. Mom told me to move the money. She said Daddy needed it to cover the club or people would talk. She said they would lose their standing. I didn't know it was stolen. I just didn't want us to look poor. The admission rang through the courtroom like a bell. I just didn't want us to look poor. Evan closed his eyes. Melissa put her head on the table and began to weep. Miles looked at Sloane, not with anger, but with pity. So, Miles said, you admit that you knowingly moved funds to help your parents hide their financial instability? Yes, Sloane sobbed. Yes, okay. Is that what you want to hear? We are broke. We have been broke for years. The only money we had was what Grandfather sent. Miles turned to the judge. He didn't need to say anything else. The mask had fallen. There was no successful business. There was no loving family. There was just a group of desperate people cannibalizing their own daughter to keep up appearances for neighbors who didn't care about them. No further questions, Miles said. He walked back to our table and sat down. Walter reached over and placed his hand on my arm. He didn't squeeze it. He just rested it there, a solid weight grounding me in the reality of what we had just done. We hadn't just won an argument. We had exposed a 5-year-long crime. The judge looked at the defendants. Her expression was no longer neutral. It was cold. We will recess for 1 hour, Judge Vance said, and then I will deliver my judgment. As the bailiff called, all rise, I looked at my parents. They didn't look at me. They were too busy looking at each other with pure, unadulterated hatred. The alliance of lies had broken, and now they were drowning in the truth. The recess ended, and the air in the courtroom had shifted from clinical observation to the heavy, static charge that precedes a thunderstorm. When Judge Vance returned to the bench, she did not look at the defense table. She looked at the clock, then at Miles. Mr. Carver, do you have any final rebuttal evidence before we move to closing arguments? She asked. Yes, Your Honor, Miles said. He stood up, holding a single piece of paper. It was not part of the thick binder he had used earlier. It was fresh, crisp, and clearly devastating. We have just received a subpoenaed vendor invoice that was processed during the recess. It connects the final dot in a way that removes any ambiguity regarding the defendant's intent. He walked to the clerk and handed over the document. The screen flickered, displaying a scanned invoice from a company called Kitchen Concepts Luxe. We have established that on November 1st, 5 years ago, Mr. Hale sent the first installment of $1,500. Miles began, his voice dropping to a register that forced everyone to lean in. We have established that on November 3rd, the defendant's account balance dropped by nearly that exact amount. The defense has argued that this was general household spending. They claimed it went into the pot of family maintenance. He pointed to the screen. This invoice is dated November 3rd. 5 years ago. Miles said, "It is a deposit receipt for a Viking professional range and a Carrara Marble Island slab. The amount paid was $1,495. He turned to look at Evan and Melissa. They did not spend the money on a home in the abstract sense, Miles said. They took a check that was explicitly marked for their daughter's rent, and within 48 hours, they converted it into a kitchen appliance. They didn't just steal the money, they renovated their lifestyle with it." The courtroom was silent. The direct link between my poverty and their luxury was no longer a theory. It was a receipt. Miles turned to Walter. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I would like to ask you one final question from where you sit. Why did you send that specific amount? Why $1,500? Walter cleared his throat. He did not need a microphone. His voice carried the weight of a man who had realized his kindness was the weapon used against his own blood. "Because Melissa told me that was exactly what Brianna needed to be safe," Walter said. He looked at his daughter. "She called me. She said Brianna had found a safe apartment in a good neighborhood, but the rent was high. She said, 'Daddy, if you send $1,500, she will be secure. If you don't, she will be on the street.' I sent the money because I was buying safety. I did not know I was buying a stove." The moral weight of his words crushed the air out of the room. It wasn't just fraud anymore. It was a specific, calculated lie designed to exploit a father's love to fund a remodel. I stood up. Miles nodded to me. It was my turn to hammer the final nail. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady. "I remember November 3rd of that year." Judge Vance looked at me. "Go on, Ms. Cole." "I was living in a sublet that was expiring." I said, "I called my parents that morning. I remember the time because I was on my lunch break at the temp agency. I called to ask if they could loan me $200 to put a hold on a studio apartment I had found. It wasn't a nice place. It had bars on the windows, but it was cheap." I looked at Melissa. She was staring at her hands, her face a mask of crumbling plaster. "My mother answered the phone," I continued. She sounded rushed. There was noise in the background, construction noise, saws, hammers. She told me, "Brianna, we cannot help you. We are dealing with repairs. The house is falling apart. We have no liquidity." And then she hung up on me. I paused, letting the timeline sink in. She hung up on me to sign the invoice for the Marble Island. I said, "She told me they had no liquidity while she was writing a check with my grandfather's money." That was the moment I realized I was alone. I slept in my car for 3 nights that week because I lost the apartment. The defense attorney, Mr. Sterling, looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. He made a half-hearted attempt to object, muttering something about emotional prejudice, but Judge Vance waved him down with a sharp flick of her wrist. She turned her gaze to the defense table. It was a withering look, devoid of any judicial patience. "Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole," the judge said, "you have heard the testimony. You have seen the bank records. You have seen the invoice. Do you have any explanation for why a kitchen renovation took precedence over your daughter's housing, using funds specifically designated for her housing?" This was the moment where they should have stayed silent. This was the moment where a united front might have saved them some shred of dignity. But panic is a solvent that dissolves loyalty, and my family was in a state of absolute, terrified panic. Evan stood up, his face red and blotchy. "It was Melissa," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at his wife. "She handles the household accounts. I just bring in the paycheck. I didn't know which check paid for what. She told me her father sent a gift for the house. She said Walter wanted us to upgrade the kitchen to increase the property value." "Evan!" Melissa shrieked, jumping to her feet. "You liar! You were the one who picked out the stove. You were the one who said we deserved it because we had worked so hard. You told me, 'Dad won't know the difference. Money is money.' It was your idea to keep it." "I did not," Evan yelled back. "I wanted to tell her. You said she was irresponsible. You said she would just waste it." "I didn't take it," Sloane cried out from her seat, her voice shrill and desperate. I just cashed the checks Mom gave me. I didn't know where it came from. Why am I being dragged into this? I am the victim here. Stop it! Judge Vance slammed her gavel down. The sound cracked through the room like a pistol shot. Stop it right now! The three of them froze. Evan was panting. Melissa was sobbing. Sloane was looking around the room. Realizing that everyone, the clerk, the bailiff, the few people in the gallery, was looking at them with expressions of pure disgust. They had just confessed, in their desperation to pin the blame on each other. They had admitted everything. Evan admitted he knew. Melissa admitted she manipulated the funds. Sloane admitted she was a willing conduit. Judge Vance leaned forward. She took off her glasses and placed them on the bench. She looked at them for a long, uncomfortable minute. In 20 years on the bench, she said, her voice quiet and dangerously calm, I have seen drug dealers protect their accomplices with more honor than this family has shown each other in the last 30 seconds. She picked up a pen and looked at the defense table. I have a simple question, Judge Vance said. It requires a yes or no answer. I do not want a story. I do not want an explanation. I want a binary response. She looked at Evan. Mr. Cole, did the $90,000 sent by Walter Hale ever, in any form, reach Brianna Cole? Evan opened his mouth. He looked at his lawyer, who was staring at the ceiling. He looked at me. No, he whispered. The judge looked at Melissa. Mrs. Cole? No, Melissa sobbed. The judge looked at Sloane. Ms. Cole? No, Sloane said, her voice barely audible. Judge Vance nodded. She wrote something down on her notepad. The scratching of her pen was the loudest sound in the world. Let the record show, Judge Vance said, that the defendants have admitted that the funds were never disbursed to the intended beneficiary. Let the record further show that they have admitted to using these funds for personal asset acquisition, while the beneficiary was in a state of financial distress. She looked up. This court has seen enough evidence to render a decision without further deliberation. I am ready to issue my ruling. My heart hammered against my ribs. Beside me, Walter let out a long, slow breath. He didn't look triumphant. He looked relieved. The fog of gaslighting that had surrounded us for 5 years had finally been blown away by the cold wind of the law. I looked at my parents one last time. They were destroyed. Not by me, and not even by the judge. They were destroyed by the truth they had tried to bury under marble countertops and country club memberships. They sat in the wreckage of their own greed, and for the first time, I felt absolutely nothing for them. No anger, no pity, just a profound sense of distance, as if I were watching strangers on a television screen. The judge reorganized her papers. She took a sip of water. The tension in the room was so tight it felt like a physical weight pressing down on our shoulders. Please stand for the verdict, the bailiff announced. I stood up. My legs felt strong. I was ready. Judge Vance did not look down at her notes when she spoke. She looked directly at the defendants, her gaze heavy with the authority of the state and the moral weight of the truth that had just been exposed. The room was so quiet that I could hear the buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead. A low drone that sounded like the humming of a wire pulled tight before it snaps. In the matter of Cole versus Cole, the judge began, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Brianna Cole. The evidence presented is not merely compelling, it is irrefutable. The defendants, Evan and Melissa Cole, engaged in a deliberate and sustained campaign of conversion, diverting funds explicitly entrusted to them for the housing and welfare of their daughter. She paused, letting the word conversion hang in the air. It was a sterile legal term for theft, but in that moment, it felt like an indictment of their souls. The court orders the immediate restitution of the principal sum of $90,000, Judge Vance declared. Furthermore, given the duration of the fraud and the breach of fiduciary duty, the court awards statutory interest calculated from the date of each misappropriated deposit. This brings the total judgment against Evan and Melissa Cole to $112,400. A sound escaped my mother's throat, a strangled gasp that sounded like a drowning woman surfacing for air. Evan slumped forward. his forehead resting on the table, his posture screaming defeat. The judge turned her eyes to Sloane. Regarding the co-defendant, Sloane Cole, the judge continued, the defense of ignorance is rejected. The records show a pattern of circular transfers designed to obfuscate the origin and destination of funds. You were not a passive observer. Ms. Cole, you were an active participant in the concealment of assets. While the court acknowledges you were acting under the influence of your parents, you are an adult. You signed the transfers. You benefited from the theft. Sloane was shaking, her face buried in her hands. The court orders a full forensic accounting of your personal finances to determine the extent of your unjust enrichment, the judge ruled. You are jointly and severally liable for $15,000 of the judgment. Furthermore, I am referring your case to the state tax authority for review regarding undeclared income. You cannot claim to be an innocent child while moving thousands of dollars through your accounts to hide it from the IRS. Then, she raised the gavel. It was a simple piece of wood, but as I watched it rise, it looked like the blade of a guillotine. This case is closed, Judge Vance said. The gavel came down, bang. That sound was the sharpest, cleanest thing I had ever heard. It cut through the air, severing the invisible cords that had tied me to that house in Maple Ridge for 32 years. It cut through the guilt. It cut through the gaslighting. It cut through the 5 years of wondering if I was the crazy one. Evan did not move. He stayed hunched over the table, a man whose facade of success had been stripped away to reveal the hollow rot beneath. Melissa was weeping openly now, loud, ugly sobs that echoed off the wood paneling, but nobody moved to comfort her, not her husband, not her daughter, and certainly not me. I stood up. I did not look at them. I did not offer a glance of pity or a look of triumph. They were no longer my parents. They were simply the defendants in a case I had won. I turned my back on their table and looked toward the exit sign glowing red above the double doors. Walter stood beside me. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "It is done," he said quietly. We walked out of the courtroom together. As the heavy doors swung shut behind us, the sound of my mother's crying was cut off instantly, replaced by the hushed murmur of the courthouse hallway. 3 weeks later, the notification popped up on my phone. It was a standard banking alert, impersonal and automated. Deposit received. I opened the app. The number was there in black and white. $112,400. I stared at the screen for a long time. I expected to feel a rush of excitement, like winning a lottery, but I didn't. This wasn't a prize. This was an apology extracted by force. This was every meal I had skipped. This was every hour I had stood on my feet at the diner until my arches collapsed. This was the root canal I had performed on myself. This was the cold nights in my car. The money was not a gift. It was a receipt for my survival. I sat down at my desk, a cheap, wobbly thing I had bought at a thrift store, and I began to work. I did not go shopping. I did not book a vacation. I did what I had learned to do in the dark. I made a plan. First, I paid the hospital. I wrote a check for the full balance of my outstanding medical bills. I paid off the credit card I had used to keep my car running. I paid the back taxes on my small business. When I pressed the submit button on the final payment, I felt a physical weight lift off my chest, a pressure I hadn't realized I had been carrying for half a decade. I was debt-free. For the first time in my adult life, I belonged to myself. The remainder of the money, roughly $80,000, went into a new business account. I typed the name into the state registration form, North Harbor Strategy Group. It was a name I had chosen carefully. A harbor is a place of safety, a place you go to repair your ship before you head back out into the open ocean. But it is also a place of commerce, of strategy, of planning. I wasn't building a fortress to hide in. I was building a launch pad. I hired an assistant the next day. I leased a small, professional office space downtown. Not a luxury suite, but a clean, bright room with a view of the river. I bought a proper ergonomic chair. I bought a coffee maker that worked. I was no longer Brianna the victim. I was Brianna the CEO. A month after the trial, I met Walter for coffee. We didn't meet at his estate or at a fancy restaurant. We met at a small cafe near my new office. He looked different. The heaviness that had hung over him during the trial had lifted. He looked like a grandfather again, not a plaintiff. He slid a newspaper across the table. It was the local business journal. On page 4, there was a small notice about the bankruptcy filing of Evan and Melissa Cole. "They are selling the house," Walter said, taking a sip of his tea. "The bank is foreclosing. The Viking stove and the marble island apparently didn't add enough value to cover the second mortgage they took out to pay your judgment." I looked at the notice. I saw the address, the house where I had grown up, the house where I had been kicked out into the snow. It was just an address now, numbers and letters. "Where will they go?" I asked. "I don't know," Walter said, "and for the first time in my life, I don't care. They have their health. They can work. They can learn what it means to survive without a safety net, just as you did." He looked at me, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. "And what about you?" Walter asked. "How do you feel? Do you feel like you won?" I looked out the window at the people walking by on the sidewalk. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, paying their bills, telling the truth. "I don't feel like I beat them." I said, "Winning implies it was a game. This wasn't a game. It was my life." I turned back to him. "I didn't win against my family." "Grandpa," I said, my voice steady and sure, "I won against the loop. I broke the cycle of being the one who absorbs the pain so everyone else can be comfortable. I broke the silence that allowed them to steal from me. That is what I won. I won my voice." Walter smiled. It was a proud smile, one that reached his eyes. "That is worth more than $90,000, he said. We finished our coffee and walked out onto the street. The winter had passed, and the first signs of spring were breaking through the gray Ohio soil. The air was crisp and smelled of rain and wet pavement. Walter hugged me, a real hug, strong and warm. "I am going back to Connecticut tomorrow," he said. "You have work to do here." "I do," I said. He got into his car and drove away. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching him go. Then, I turned around. I didn't look back toward the suburbs, where my parents were packing boxes in a house they no longer owned. I didn't look back at the courthouse where the gavel had fallen. I looked toward the building down the street, where the sign for North Harbor Strategy Group was being installed on the glass door. I adjusted my coat, took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air, and started walking. I walked toward my business. I walked toward my future. I walked into the light, and I didn't look back once. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below sharing your city or country. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this journey of justice, please make sure to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us.